You don't notice it at first. The room is quiet. Too quiet. Maybe, but it feels like peace. Your breath slows. Your shoulders drop. You think you're in control. Then, something shifts. A glance. A pause. A silence that weighs a little too heavy in the air. No insults, no shouting, just that slight narrowing of their eyes. And suddenly, you're the one apologizing. Tonight, we begin where all manipulation starts, not with words, but with presence. Welcome to a different kind of story. One that doesn't race toward resolution, but rather drifts slow and steady through the strange corridors of power, control, and suggestion. If you're listening in bed right now, you're in the perfect place. Just breathe and listen. And maybe don't trust anyone with a perfectly neutral smile. Oh, and a gentle warning. You probably won't make it through this day, but that's all right. That's kind of the point. Before we slip into the psychological shadows, feel free to tap like gently it tells the algorithm you're still alive. Maybe even subscribe if you enjoy being softly unsettled while drifting off. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about knowing strangers everywhere are falling asleep to the same strange story. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You're standing on an empty train platform in 1950s London. Fog wraps around your legs like a cat with secrets. The lights overhead buzz faintly, flickering like they're unsure of themselves. A timetable ticks behind you, completely irrelevant to the man now approaching from the far end of the platform. He walks like someone who doesn't need to rush, and he looks at you just a second too long before turning away again. You tell yourself not to read into it. He didn't say anything. He didn't do anything, but you feel something anyway. A disquiet in the chest, like you've been seen through instead of seen. And that's the thing about nonverbal control. It doesn't announce itself. It glides past your radar and builds a home in your decisions. Historians still debate whether ancient Roman generals were trained in silent influence, or whether they just developed the art on their own. Tacitus, the Roman historian, once wrote about a commander who could dismiss a soldier with nothing more than a sideways glance. That sounds like an exaggeration, sure, but we all know a look can change the mood of a room faster than a trumpet. There's an obscure ritual, still practiced in some rural parts of Sardinia, called su conatu, where two people will sit silently in a room for an hour before ever exchanging words. It's said that during that hour, reputations are decided. No need for conversation. Your posture, your breath, your stillness, they tell the whole story. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. This isn't magic. It's psychology. Micro, expressions, dominance cues, spatial framing. All happening below conscious awareness. You react before you know you've reacted. A person who knows how to stay silent while holding your gaze, that's a manipulator's favorite weapon. Remember the man on the platform? He hasn't left. He's just standing there now, a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, breathing like someone who's already made a decision about you. You don't even realize you've taken a step back, but he does. And that's all he needed. Let's rewind the tape, slow it down to the very beginning of the behavior, before the manipulation, before the fear. Back to something far more mundane, a dinner party. You're sitting at a long, polished table in someone's meticulously decorated home. Candles flicker, wine glasses glisten. Conversation flows like lukewarm gravy. Across the table, someone laughs too loudly, and you instinctively glance to the host just to check. And there it is again, that barely perceptible narrowing of the eyes, the pause between their sips, a certain stillness that doesn't quite match the warmth in their voice. You wonder if you said something wrong. You wonder if it's about you at all. And already they're winning. See, manipulators rarely interrupt the moment. They lean into it. They let you squirm just enough to fill in the silence with your own insecurity. If they're really good, they can steer your guilt without uttering a single sentence. It's like emotional ventriloquism. There's a reason the KGB trained agents to detect power posture before a subject even opened their mouth. Historical records mention chairs intentionally placed 1 inch higher than others in interrogation rooms, not to dominate, just to slightly tilt the sense of power. You wouldn't even notice, but you'd feel it. Weird cultural tidbit for you? In ancient Japan, tea ceremonies were sometimes used as political battlegrounds. The host who poured last could signal submission or demand obedience, depending on how the cup was turned. Imagine being emotionally dismantled by a humble serving of matcha. And yes, psychologists still argue whether these cues work cross-culturally or if we're just wired to interpret power from context. But one thing's agreed on: silence can speak. And in the hands of a skilled manipulator, it screams. Back at the table, your fork hovers over your plate. The host tilts their head just a little. You smile, unsure why. Maybe to please. Maybe to soothe something that hasn't been said yet. And there it is. They've taken space in your head without paying rent. Now imagine that happening day after day. In your job, your relationship, your friendships. They never raise their voice. They don't need to. You do it for them internally. You edit yourself in real time to avoid that unreadable look. You rehearse sentences before speaking. You notice which topics are safer. You shrink, all while they just sit there, pleasant, unbothered, watching. Now, you might say, well, some people are just quiet. Sure. So is a snake before it strikes. Don't worry, though. You're safe here. And remember the candle-lit dinner party? You'll be back there again soon. Just wait. So now you're back at that same dinner party. The plates have been cleared. Dessert has been served, something delicate with too many syllables, topped with a mint leaf that no one eats but everyone pretends to admire. The air smells faintly of cardamom, ego, and low-stakes hostility. You try to relax, but your spine knows better. Someone across the room says something innocuous, and still your host's eyes drift. The flicker is almost imperceptible. But you catch it. Again. They haven't corrected you. They haven't sighed. They haven't even frowned. They just looked. And like clockwork, your chest tightens. Your posture shifts. You adjust your napkin. Apologize with your body language for something. This is the moment most people miss. Compliance without confrontation. You give up a piece of your power before a single word has been spoken. See, that's the brilliance of nonverbal psychological control. It's not a war, it's a whisper campaign with your own mind. The manipulator doesn't need to dominate the room. They just tilt it. Their real trick? Making you think it was your idea to shrink? A famous case from history proves how silent influence can become policy. We're in 17th century France now. Versailles, to be exact. Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, had a peculiar talent for social manipulation. He didn't scream or rage to keep the nobles in check. No, he built a palace of mirrors. Literally. The famed Hall of Mirrors wasn't just opulence, it was strategy. He made the court live under a constant, quiet gaze. Every angle reflected. Every movement on display. Everyone performing subtly, endlessly for power they would never actually touch. Historians still debate whether Louis understood the psychological brilliance of surveillance by reflection, or if he just liked shiny things. Either way, it worked. And speaking of mirrors, that's what the host across from you is doing now, mirroring your posture ever so slightly, matching your rhythm, your cadence, your phrasing. You think you're clicking, that you're vibing, that they get you. But the irony is, they're not joining you. They're leading you without leading. That's one of the oldest tricks in dark psychology. Mimicry. It builds trust faster than logic ever could. Your brain sees a copy of itself and mistakes it for safety. They lean forward. So you do too. They soften their tone. So yours drops. And just like that, your guard lowers, not from charm, but from pattern. There's an obscure psychological study, hard to find. half forgotten that tested how waiters could earn higher tips. The best performing ones? They didn't flatter. They didn't overserve. They simply repeated your order back to you, word for word. No commentary, no approval, just reflection. And people tipped them more, feeling seen, controlled, in the friendliest way possible. So back to your fork, which you've now rotated 3 times without realizing. Your host's voice is like velvet around your throat, soft, warm, gently tightening. They ask about your job, but they already know the answer. They nod with interest they don't feel, and you respond like you're auditioning for something. You don't know what exactly. This is what people misunderstand about manipulation. It's not always about getting something big. Sometimes it's about training small obedience. Like gently pushing a sheep toward the right gate. No sticks, no prodding, just footsteps, carefully placed. There's a phrase used in intelligence circles, subtle shaping. It means altering someone's belief or behavior over time without direct instruction. Not by telling them what to think, but by rearranging the environment around their thoughts, social pressure, body language, timing. And yes, entire elections have turned on such methods. Quiet hands behind loud voices. But let's not dig into that. You're trying to sleep, not spiral. Let's zoom out again. Out of this room, this night, this perf. They just raise an eyebrow and change the subject. Someone doesn't control your decisions. They simply set up your environment. So you only ever choose what they wanted anyway. That's how the mind is led. With gestures, not chains. Now rest here for a moment. Let your mind wander. Imagine warm stone underfoot, the fading call of the muezzin in the air, and the distant rustle of palm leaves swaying over a river that once carried gold, gossip, and secrets, too heavy for paper. You are surrounded by the kind of silence that hums with memory. And here, in this soft cradle of ancient psychology, you begin to understand something important. Words are overrated. Real power doesn't need them. So when someone speaks too little, listen harder. When someone pauses before answering, wonder why. And when you feel smaller without knowing why, you've probably just entered someone else's story, without an invitation. Now close your eyes a little longer. Let the Sahara winds smooth your thoughts. The night is still long, and our story is only just beginning to unfold. You're not dreaming, but you might as well be. The ground beneath you is no longer the sun-warmed clay of West Africa. It's stone now, cool, polished, deliberate. You're walking through a corridor carved into rock, its walls smoothed by centuries of footsteps, prayers, and second guesses. Welcome to Lalibela, Ethiopia, a city carved downward, into the earth, rather than built upward toward the sky. The churches here aren't raised, they're revealed, hewn from solid rock, quiet cathedrals that whisper humility with every stairwell. And yet, their silence feels powerful, because power doesn't always rise. Sometimes it digs. The man who ordered these monolithic churches in the 12th century, King Lalibela, claimed to have been commanded by angels. Maybe he was. Or maybe he just understood something deeper, something psychological. See, the structure of Lalibela doesn't scream wealth. It doesn't boast like the Vatican or glitter like Mecca. But it buries you in awe. It forces you downward physically and emotionally. It makes you small, on purpose. That, friend, is a form of emotional manipulation. Most people pay good money for today. Only now we call it humbling. Historians still debate whether King Lalibela built these churches as divine homage or political misdirection. Perhaps he simply knew how to make people feel something bigger than themselves, and then point to himself as the interpreter. Because when someone controls how you experience awe, they can quietly install themselves as the middleman between you and transcendence. And, let's be honest, most manipulators want exactly that. To be the translator between you and your own reality. Now back to you. You're walking slower now. The tunnel is dim. There's light up ahead, but it bends in, not out like it's curling back toward the source. And here's something curious. You're not walking alone. Someone's just behind you. You don't hear their footsteps, but you feel their attention. That same disquiet from the train station. The host at the table. The man in the fog. You want to turn around, but you don't. Why? Because manipulators don't chase. They wait. And part of you knows turning around would be the beginning of their next move. Instead, you keep walking, the air pressing slightly against your skin like breath that isn't yours. This is how subtle psychological conditioning works. You've been taught to doubt the unseen, to silence the inner warning bells in favor of rationality. But logic doesn't keep you safe from suggestion. In many African spiritual traditions, particularly in the Congo Basin, there's the belief in Nkisi, ritual objects inhabited by spirits that do not speak but influence. A nail driven into an Nkisi figure doesn't scream punishment. It simply shifts reality, quietly, unforgivingly. Control isn't declared, it's embedded. Manipulation isn't spoken. It's felt. Now let's drift again, this time towards southern Africa, to the kingdom of Zimbabwe, around the 11th century. A fortress of stone so meticulously placed, it still stands, despite centuries of wind, rain, and colonial erasure. Great Zimbabwe was a city without mortar, each stone resting against the next in calculated tension. It was a psychological marvel. Why? Because the architecture told you how to behave. Walls were curved to disorient invaders. Narrow paths forced single-file movement, ensuring submission without force. Even today, archaeologists wonder how people obeyed invisible laws, etched into stone without signs or soldiers. But the locals didn't need instructions. They understood the message. Move how the walls say, or don't move at all. And that's what manipulators do best. They build walls inside your mind. You follow paths that seem natural, but were designed for you. You think you chose the route, but you're just following their architecture. You reach a doorway now, arched, narrow, a threshold. And here's the most manipulative part. It's beautiful. Manipulation rarely arrives looking like a threat. It arrives like an invitation, a gentle question, a well-lit hallway, a compliment that lands a little too perfectly. You step through the arch. The room opens, and you feel relief for a moment. This is how it works, after all. The tension, the release, the lead-up, the letdown. Every manipulative cycle is built like a symphony, dissonance, resolution, applause. You're standing now in what looks like a chamber. Circular, windowless. The ceiling dome's just high enough to make you look up. Your shoulders drop. You exhale. And then, you notice the circle of chairs. They weren't there before. You're sure of it. But here they are. 12 of them. Facing inward. Empty. Except one. There's someone seated across from you. Not close enough to be a threat. Not far enough to forget. They're watching. You don't know how long they've been there. And that alone is the manipulation. See, powerful manipulators don't control through action. They control through timing. They wait until you need their presence to explain your reality. And then they appear. It's the friend who calls right after your breakup, not with support, but with opportunity. It's the coworker who just happens to be available when your confidence dips. It's the ex who reappears during your weakest moment, saying all the right things. Their timing is not kindness. It's choreography. There's a saying among the Dogon people of Mali. The drum never speaks before the dancer is ready. In other words, never waste your influence before the subject is primed. Manipulators are expert drummers. They wait for your vulnerability. Then they strike the rhythm you are already aching to hear. You sit down now. Slowly. Almost without deciding to. Your chair faces the other. Your eyes adjust. And you realize you still can't see their face clearly. It's shadowed, comfortable, but precise. You begin to speak, but you're not sure why. Maybe to break the silence. Maybe because your body remembers the feeling of needing to fill the gaps. And as you talk about nothing, really you notice their posture change. Just slightly. A lean forward. An eyebrow rise. Nothing hostile. Nothing loud. But your tone adjusts in response. Your smile twitches. You try harder. You are being shaped. They're not saying anything. They don't need to. The quiet pressure of their gaze, the small rewards of their subtle attention, it's enough. You've entered the soft machinery of psychological submission. Now, some may scoff and say, this is overthinking. People are just people. And, sure, maybe they're right. Maybe. But scholars still debate whether the ruins at Great Zimbabwe were primarily religious, political, or economic in function. It could have been all three, because true influence is never one-dimensional. It doesn't announce itself in banners. It hides in design, in the layout of your life, in the timing of their text, in the way their silence makes you desperate to fill it. And so here you are, in a circular room with one chair occupied, saying more than you should, thinking more than is comfortable, and they're just sitting there, smiling, waiting. This is not a climax. It's not even a confrontation. It's what manipulators love most. The quiet win. You offered it to them wrapped in your need to be understood. They didn't ask for it. They didn't have to. They've already arranged the room. You wake up slowly, not in your bed, not in any familiar room, but somewhere sun-warmed, silent and strange. There's sand in your teeth. Or perhaps that's just your imagination filling the gaps, the way your mind always tries to make sense of what it doesn't understand. Brains hate ambiguity like toddlers at bedtime. They kick and scream until things feel neat and tucked in. The air here carries a dry, earthy whisper. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleats, and you remember you're in Timbuktu. Not the metaphorical one your uncle jokes about when he's trying to sound mysterious. The real one. The city of scholars, the sand-covered treasure of Mali, once bustling with golden manuscripts and silent power plays. It's quiet now, but it wasn't always. Centuries ago, Timbuktu was a metropolis of minds. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the city thrived under the Mali Empire and then the Songhai. Libraries overflowed with philosophical texts, astronomy charts, and thick tracts on ethics and divine order. One could argue Timbuktu was the birthplace of African behavioral psychology, only they didn't call it that. They called it wisdom. Sometimes you have to rebrand something before people listen. One dusty manuscript from the Ahmed Baba Institute contains what reads like early crowd psychology, a passage warning against men who speak little, yet draw many into their cause through gaze and gesture. Manipulation, you see, has always been a silent art. Words are overrated, especially when you can weaponize stillness. And in Timbuktu, stillness was sacred, speech reserved. Respect was measured by how little you said and how well you listened. You pass a crumbling doorway where a once great imam delivered sermons, not loudly, not theatrically, but in the slow, rolling cadence that made men weep without knowing why. He understood a basic tenet of what modern theorists like Albert Mehrabian would later suggest. Communication is only 7% verbal. The rest? Tone, body, pause. And oh, how powerful a pause can be. You're walking now, barefoot, as though you've always belonged to the sand. As you pass ancient adobe buildings, an old woman with henned hands gestures toward a shadowy alley. She doesn't speak, but her meaning is clear. Walk that way. See what you find. You obey. It's in this alley that something peculiar happens. A wooden mask, likely Dogon, hangs from a nail in the wall. Its eyes are hollow, its mouth a strange curve between grin and snarl. For a moment, you feel watched, not by someone, but by the idea of someone. Ever felt that? A gaze that isn't real, but somehow penetrates your thoughts. This is the power of symbolic presence. Manipulators use it often, a photo left on a desk, a gift that keeps showing up in every room, a sigh that says nothing but reminds you of everything you owe. The Dogon people from the cliffs of central Mali believed their masks held ancestral spirits channels between worlds. These masks didn't talk, they didn't move, but they controlled behavior. People walked differently around them, chose silence over confrontation, avoided disobedience. That's what manipulation often is. Not force, not even persuasion, just the careful suggestion that you're being seen and judged. Modern behavioral theorists like Irving Goffman wrote about this under the umbrella of dramaturgy, the theory that life is a performance, and we each wear masks. But the Dogon understood this before anyone in a university lecture hall ever gave it a fancy name. As you move deeper into the alley, it darkens. Not ominously, just enough to remind you that you are always walking between stories you understand and those you never will. You sit down near a cracked step. The air smells of dried millet and dust. A baby cries somewhere in the distance, then stops, likely soothed by the silent, swaying rhythm of its mother's back, because words aren't the only lullabies. Now think, how often have you been swayed by someone who never raised their voice? How many times did a tilt of the head, a long pause, a well-timed silence undo you? There's a theory, Langer's mindfulness theory, that says we are more susceptible to subtle suggestion when our minds are on autopilot. If you're half present, you're fully programmable. Manipulators love that. They'll let you talk yourself into a decision they planted hours ago. No resistance. No confrontation. Just you, following their path as if it were your own idea. Remember that awkward dinner from Section 4? The one where nobody said what they meant? That was a symphony of wordless manipulation. Smiles like currency. Eye contact like landmines. One woman touching her wine glass a little too often, because repetition can be hypnotic. You realize it now. The most controlling people often say the least. Because every time you fill in the blanks, you do their work for them. A donkey trots past, led by a boy who looks barely old enough to carry his own shadow. He whistles a tune older than time. One of those ancestral melodies with no composer, no chorus, and no end. Some say these songs are the first social scripts we ever learned. Before language, rhythm, before manipulation, mimicry, and before betrayal, there was simply the desire to belong, which, frankly, is still the root of every manipulative relationship. Even the great Sundiata, Keita founder of the Mali Empire, understood that power often came not from declarations, but from quiet influence. According to some griot traditions, Sundiata would walk through villages without speaking, simply observing. Those who tried too hard to impress him were noted. Those who asked nothing were elevated. Historians still debate whether this was deliberate strategy or just an introvert's way of avoiding small talk, but the pattern held power. And power, like silence, accumulates. Here's your cultural tidbit. In certain Fulani communities, it's considered impolite to speak directly about one's desires. You must hint, suggest, offer a metaphor, and let the other person do the math. A Fulani man may say, "The grass is dry this season," when what he means is, "I'm hungry, and you should probably feed me." It's not manipulation, it's culture. But it proves a point. People are conditioned to communicate beneath the surface, and manipulators exploit this fluency like seasoned pickpockets. You've probably been in relationships like this, where nothing is said out loud, but the consequences for disobedience are unmistakable. A look, a shrug, the silence after you speak, heavier than a scream. There's a psychology quote, often attributed to Viktor Frankl, though scholars still argue about its exact origin. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. That space is what manipulators hijack. They shorten it, confuse it, crowd it with emotional fog until you're reacting instead of choosing. You stare back at the Dogon mask on the wall. still watching, still judging. But now you understand, perhaps it was never the mask. It was you, projecting fear, seeking cues, interpreting silence as meaning. And that's what manipulation feeds on, your need to make sense of silence. So here, in the slow decay of Timbuktu's golden age, among lost manuscripts and ghostly eyes, you realize something. You've been controlled more by what wasn't said than whatever was. And somehow, that's more terrifying than anything, but also beautiful, because in that awareness, there's a strange kind of freedom. You open your eyes figuratively, because let's be honest, you're already in bed, and you're standing on sun-baked earth. It's a dry season somewhere along the Great Rift Valley. The wind here carries dust, distant cattle bells, and the invisible hum of history. The sky is wide, and your thoughts are narrow, curling around something you can't quite name. Maybe it's the way someone in your life always makes you question your own memory, or how that silence they give you speaks louder than words. You're not imagining it. Silence, in the hands of a manipulator, is an instrument more effective than shouting, more terrifying than threats. It's the psychological equivalent of crossing your arms and waiting for the other person to squirm. This isn't new. In fact, let's drift to the Sahel, the stretch of semi-arid land south of the Sahara. There, in the ancient city of Timbuktu, yes, it's a real place. Not just where socks go missing, power used to flow silently, through scholars. The libraries here, filled with Arabic manuscripts, whispered authority. Timbuktu was a 14th century stronghold of knowledge, where the elite understood that influence didn't have to be loud. They wrote theology, astronomy, love spells, and they knew intellectual dominance could shame a king more thoroughly than a blade. A quote rises from the dust. Power is not revealed through noise, but through its absence. An old West African proverb, author unknown. Probably because whoever said it was smart enough to stay anonymous. The manipulators in your life probably operate the same way. Ever notice how they let you talk, nodding gently, saying nothing but later? They use your words against you. That's called strategic silence. It falls under a broader framework in dark psychology, the theory of covert emotional manipulation, where control is exercised not by direct confrontation, but by calculated omissions. When someone tells you, "I didn't lie, I just didn't say anything," you've stepped into the domain of the double bind. Gregory Bateson, a cultural anthropologist and thinker who probably got very few dinner party invites, coined this term in the 1950s. A double bind happens when every option you're given results in punishment. Imagine a manipulator telling you, "If you loved me, you'd understand without me explaining. But if you guess wrong, I can't believe you think that about me. And if you ask for clarity, you always need everything spelled out for you. So you're stuck. Talking makes it worse. Silence makes it worse. Being intuitive makes it worse. Not being intuitive well, you get the idea. Now, come with me to the ancient kingdom of Kush, located in what is now Sudan. The Kandake queens, powerful warrior queens, often ruled with authority that didn't require visible displays of dominance. Their legacy was preserved in the stillness of pyramids, the angle of spears in murals, and the posture of guards in sandstone carvings. Silence wasn't just golden, it was strategic. It allowed power to feel inevitable, as natural as heat in the desert. Manipulators learn from history, even if they've never opened a textbook. They know how to use atmosphere. They know how to create ambiguity. You've been in rooms with people who say nothing, yet fill the air with implication. That's the same psychological terrain those Kushite queens ruled from. The most powerful is he who has himself in his own power. Seneca said that, sure, but African rulers embodied it, and manipulators weaponize it. When someone controls their emotions like a thermostat behind a glass panel, you can't touch it, can't change it, you only feel the heat or cold. Let's take a breath. Look around you. Imagine a thick canopy of trees in Central Africa. The Congo Basin, where ecosystems, cultures, and colonial scars all live in messy coexistence. It's here that oral tradition ruled for centuries. Words mattered. But what wasn't said? That mattered more. Silence wasn't emptiness, it was coded. Manipulators use this same coding. They suggest instead of state. They imply instead of assert. You'll hear them say, "I just find it interesting that I thought you'd understand." I mean, you do what you want, of course. These phrases are designed to bypass your rational defense system and hook straight into your emotions. Let's switch gears slowly. Like a story carried from grandmother to granddaughter. Ever heard of Ubuntu? It's a Southern African philosophy meaning, I am because we are. A beautiful, ideal interconnectedness, mutual respect, community. But twisted in the hands of a manipulator, this too becomes a trap. They guilt you into surrendering your boundaries. You're supposed to care about the group. You're selfish for putting yourself first. You're breaking the unity. Psychologists call this moral coercion. It's the use of shared ideals to enforce compliance. And when it's dressed in cultural or spiritual language, it's nearly impossible to argue against. Now, drift with me to Ethiopia, where ancient stone churches sit carved directly into the ground at Lalibela. Spiritual manipulation, like those rock-hewn sanctuaries, is not built on obvious structures. It is carved from the silence, from the hidden. If someone ever made you feel like disagreeing with them meant you were wrong morally, not logically, you've been spiritually manipulated. Here's a lovely quote to think about, one that's often misattributed but always rings true. Beware the man who speaks in righteousness, but acts in silence. Let's return to your own timeline, shall we? Think about the last argument you lost before it began. Not because you were wrong, but because you felt unsure, destabilized. That's not coincidence. That's gaslighting by omission. A form of manipulation where someone rewrites reality by refusing to confirm it. In a study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, researchers found that consistent emotional withholding caused stress responses similar to abandonment trauma. And guess what? Emotional silence activates the same parts of the brain that respond to physical pain. Yes, your brain lights up the same way whether someone slaps you or just ghosts your existence. Historians still debate whether silence in ancient diplomacy was a sign of restraint or passive aggression. But most agree, it always carried weight. In our own lives, it carries even more. So the next time someone just doesn't respond, remember, inaction is an action. Silence is never neutral. And just like those ancient manuscripts of Timbuktu that were hidden from colonial invaders, the truth of manipulation is often buried under layers. Sometimes all you can do is start gently unearthing it. And you just did. You didn't expect to end up in this room. But here you are. Another low-lit interior, a soft ticking clock somewhere behind the plaster wall, and the quiet sound of a kettle that no one remembers putting on. The kind of place where even your thoughts feel like they're whispering so they don't wake something up, something old, maybe something cunning. You sit with yourself in this space, and again you start noticing the way your shoulders ache from carrying emotions that weren't yours, the way your fingers twitch around truths you still haven't spoken. Because deep down, you know something most people don't. Manipulators don't need to yell. They just need you to question yourself. Welcome to the silent art of suggestion. Let's talk about a tactic that's older than the kingdoms of men. Implication. The subtle raise of an eyebrow. The pause before agreement. The way someone leaves a sentence hanging like a freshly baited hook. This isn't mere body language. It's emotional architecture designed to steer your responses while making you think it was your idea all along. The best manipulators never actually say, "You're wrong." They ask questions like, "Are you sure you're remembering that correctly?" They don't accuse. They smile. And you, poor you, find yourself apologizing for things you were once sure of. They erode confidence not with force, but with friction. Slowly, imperceptibly, and repeatedly. Remember the concept of double binds? It's a psychological snare where, no matter how you respond, you're wrong. Say yes, and you're naive. Say no, and you're combative. This tactic was described by Gregory Bateson, an anthropologist who may have spent too much time watching people at dinner parties. His theory, that some family dynamics trap children in these paradoxes so tightly, their only escape is to disassociate. You know, light bedtime topics. In many traditional African royal courts, take for example the Oyo Empire in what is now Nigeria, court linguists and griots used implication as a tool of political strategy. Open criticism of the king was forbidden, so advice came in parables, jokes, or what scholars call oriki, praise poetry that could, if you listened closely, carry a sharp rebuke hidden in ornate compliments. Imagine being insulted in song form and thanking them for it. Even the kings weren't safe from the slow burn of psychological maneuvering. And this, perhaps, is what makes silent manipulation so universal. It doesn't require social standing. It just requires patience. A quote comes to mind, often misattributed but still poignant. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Steve Biko, or perhaps someone channeling his fury decades later. Now, let's revisit that memory you still tiptoe around the friend who always had a way of making you feel inferior without ever raising their voice. They never called you lazy. They just sighed when you mentioned your goals. They never said you were a burden. They just looked tired when you entered the room. And maybe, just maybe, you began adapting, smiling more, shrinking more, apologizing more. These are the bruises you can't photograph, the scars people don't believe in, because the manipulation wasn't loud. It was polite, gracious even. And that's what makes it powerful. In Igbo culture, there's a saying, "He who will hold another down in the mud must stay in the mud to keep him there." A warning that those who manipulate must also live in the very darkness they create. And yet, some seem oddly comfortable there. Have you noticed the silence manipulators keep? It's not the absence of noise, it's the calculation of when to remain still. The waiting, the withholding. It's the pause before a response that makes you over-explain yourself. The deliberate, unread message. The scene without the reply. A tactic as common in digital life as it was in ancient palaces. You want to believe silence means peace, but manipulators use silence as punctuation, as dominance, as denial dressed in velvet. Take a moment. Breathe. Feel how much weight those unspoken moments carry. Even now, there are stories recorded in ash and ivory, in desert carvings and bark-cloth scrolls, that suggest silence wasn't always passive. In the kingdom of Kush, modern-day Sudan, warrior queens were known to lead without shouting. Amanirenas, for instance, negotiated peace with Rome after burning down a military camp, then returned to her city and never boasted of it. Historians still debate whether her silence was diplomacy or disdain, but maybe that's the point. Sometimes silence speaks louder than history allows, and that's why manipulators love it. A manipulator's silence is not your silence. Yours is for recovery. Theirs is for design. But the good news? Once you recognize the tactic, it loses power. You start to hear the pauses not as signs of your fault, but as evidence of their intention. You begin to speak, not to defend yourself, but to clear the air inside your lungs. You reclaim sound. The most dangerous manipulation is the kind you don't notice until you're narrating your life in someone else's voice. But the moment you remember your own, that's the beginning of freedom. The kettle clicks off. The ticking clock continues. You exhale, a little deeper now, and in the quiet, your thoughts grow louder, not in panic, but in clarity, because this time, the silence belongs to you. You lie there, wrapped in half light, half thought. Maybe you shift your weight on the pillow just a little, and maybe, in that shift, something else softens. Not in your muscles, but in your memory. Because you've started to see them now, the cracks. The moments that didn't feel quite right back then, but slipped through your mind, like silk through fingertips. This section is for those cracks. Let's talk about emotional reversals. If you've ever been with someone who flips the script so fast, it gives your conscience whiplash, then you know what I mean. 1 minute, you're the hero of the story. The next, you're the villain. And the worst part? You believe them. This tactic isn't new. In fact, we can trace it through time like a trail of smoke. In medieval courts, particularly those in the Holy Roman Empire, it was common for noble advisors to sway a monarch by reframing their emotions. They didn't say, "You're angry." They said, "Your Majesty's mercy has been tested beyond measure." That's not just flattery. That's an emotional reversal disguised as loyalty. In modern terms, emotional reversals are the narcissist's favorite game. They hurt you, then cry harder than you do. They insult you, then act offended that you're upset. They push you, then claim you're attacking them. This isn't just confusion. It's trained confusion. Designed, calculated, delivered in a velvet glove, with a dagger behind the wrist. When they say, "You're too sensitive," what they mean is, "You noticed." When they say, "I was just joking," they mean, "You weren't supposed to call me out." The gaslight flickers. The room spins. But now, you're catching on. Let's bring in a bit of dark psychology. Intermittent reinforcement. It's the same method casinos use. You don't win every time. You win just enough. To stay addicted, manipulators do this with affection. They'll be cruel for 3 days, then bring flowers. They'll ghost you for a week, then send a thinking of you message at 2:37 a.m. And that one sweet gesture, it hits harder than all the cruelty combined. Why? Because your nervous system starts to crave the rare dopamine spike. Not the person, just the feeling. This isn't romance. It's psychological conditioning. In the early 1900s, behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner studied this using pigeons and pellets. Press the lever, get a treat. But if you only give the treat randomly, the pigeons press harder, obsessively, desperately. Sound familiar? You may have been trained like this without even knowing it. But once you do know, the spell begins to break. Now, let's travel just for a moment to feudal Japan. There was a term among shinobi, yes, the actual ninja, called kagemusha, meaning shadow warrior, a body double used to mislead enemies. These shadows would mimic a daimyo, feudal lord, standing in their place, copying their style, speech, posture. It worked so well that sometimes the enemy never realized they were fighting a ghost. Modern manipulators do this too, emotionally. They become your kagemusha. They mirror your personality, your passions, your wounds. They learn what makes you you, then reflect it back at you until you feel seen, deeply seen. But it's not connection. It's camouflage. And when the moment is right, when you're invested, entangled, emotionally bound, they drop the mirror and reveal the real self. By then, your defenses are so lowered you barely recognize the shift. You might even blame yourself for the change. That's the cruel genius of shadow mimicry. But again, here's the quiet strength you carry. Once you see the trick, it stops working. You start noticing the delay before their empathy, the unnatural echo in their compliments, the chill behind their concern. And bit by bit, the mask slips. Not dramatically, but enough. This isn't to say every kind gesture is manipulation, but when the pattern is laced with guilt, confusion, and fear, listen to the pattern. In folklore across West Africa, there's the story of the Ajija, a spirit that whispers lies sweetly into your ear until you forget who you are. It doesn't possess you violently. It simply tells you what you want to hear, just twisted enough to lead you astray. The only way to escape it, they say, is to speak your real name aloud in the dark, to remember yourself, even when no one else does. And maybe that's what you're doing now. Maybe this late-night stillness isn't just sleep's doorstep, it's a remembering of your own voice, your boundaries, your name. You are not too sensitive. You are not imagining things. You are not too much or not enough. You are exactly as aware as you need to be. And now you carry words like shields instead of wounds. So rest here in the safety of knowing. You have already begun. You're still here, still listening, still breathing softly into the night. That says something, doesn't it? Maybe louder than any scream ever could. Because awareness, real, quiet awareness, isn't loud. It doesn't always come with thunderclaps or revelations. Sometimes it tiptoes in like the scent of rain through a window. Sometimes it's the silence after the chaos that finally lets you hear yourself again. And that's where we are now. Let's talk about identity erosion, a central tool in the dark psychology of manipulation. A narcissist doesn't simply want control. Control alone is too fragile. What they want is compliance. And to achieve that, they gradually chip away at your sense of self until what remains is a version of you that fits inside them. You start to speak softer, dress different, question your instincts. You abandon hobbies that once lit your soul, not because they asked directly, but because somehow they made you feel small for loving them. You give up friends not overnight, of course, but drip by drip. You stop texting them back. You grow uncomfortable at their praise, because now you know someone who makes your confidence feel like arrogance. It's subtle, surgical. The phrase often used in dark psychology circles is narcissistic mirroring, followed by inversion. First, they become your reflection. Then, slowly, you become theirs. You'll hear their phrases come out of your mouth. You'll see their values begin to shape your decisions. And one day, you'll catch your own eyes in the mirror and feel like a stranger. But not anymore. Not here. Because something in you is beginning to unmirror. Let's anchor this with something from history. In the 1600s, during the colonial conquest of West Africa, local cultures experienced a systematic unraveling of their identities. Traditional names were replaced with Christian ones. Spiritual symbols were demonized. Cultural stories and oral histories, generations old, were labeled primitive. The goal wasn't just domination. It was displacement. If you can't kill the body, kill the soul. Narcissists do the same thing, just on a personal level. They don't want to love you. They want to rewrite you. And this is where you reclaim something powerful. Your original script. The things you used to laugh at when no one was watching. The music that used to make your body sway like a branch in wind. The voice in your gut you stopped trusting. It's all still there, waiting for you. There's a quote from Audre Lorde that feels like a lighthouse here. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Let that sink in like warm tea on a cold night. Because the fantasies of a narcissist are a cage. And you are the key. Let's move gently now into future faking. It's one of the most seductive and devastating tools in a manipulator's box. They paint you a picture, not of now, but of someday. We'll move in together once things settle down. Once I get this job, I'll finally have time for us. I see us growing old together. Just trust me. But the future never arrives. Or if it does, it always just missed the bus. Something always comes up. The timeline moves. The promise delays. The goalpost shifts. You're kept in a state of almost there, of waiting, of hoping. It's not hope, though. It's a leash. There's an African proverb that says, "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." That's what future faking does. It leaves you cold long enough that even false warmth feels like salvation. But now, you've stopped shivering. You've remembered the truth. Love does not live in the future. It lives in what is shown, not what is said. Love does not delay indefinitely. Love arrives. Let's pause for a second and breathe into something older than even the darkest psychology. In many indigenous tribes across the Congo Basin, through the plains of Mali, into the deserts of Namibia, healing was communal. When someone was spiritually wounded or lost, the elders would bring them into a circle, not to diagnose, but to remember them back into themselves. They'd sing the person's song, yes, everyone had their own, and call them back to the center of who they were, not to judge, not to fix, but to remind. You, right now, are doing just that. You're singing yourself back, and maybe it's messy, maybe it's quiet, maybe it's one note at a time, but it's music nonetheless. So what comes next? Well, now we talk about the final, desperate maneuver narcissists use when they feel your strength returning. The reset button. They pretend nothing happened. They show up with warmth, normalcy, laughter, as if the storm never came, as if you imagined the thunder. This is called hoovering, like the vacuum cleaner. They try to suck you back in, clean and tidy and blank. But you are no longer blank. You remember now. You see the patterns, even when they arrive with a smile. And here's the most beautiful truth of all. You do not owe your peace to anyone who took it. You do not owe your softness to someone who sharpened it against you. And you do not owe your sleep to a nightmare you've outgrown. You can rest now. Truly, the grip they had is loosening. The echo is fading. And you are beginning to hear the sound of your own name again, spoken in your own voice. Still, calm, whole, and that sound, it's beautiful. You wake to the sound of a slow, rhythmic knocking. It's not threatening, it's just there, persistent. Like a thought you tried to bury 2 years ago that somehow learned how to play the drums. The knock is coming from the inside this time. You open your eyes, but there's nothing. No visitor. Just the room, dim and amber-toned, where shadows from your window grill crosshatch your walls like prison bars. The fan spins lazily above you, not cooling anything, only reminding you of how time likes to move in circles. Your thoughts? They're already halfway through the door, unraveling the day's tension before your feet touch the floor. Remember that story we whispered through last night? The one about the chief who used silence like a weapon? That still lingers in the walls. But tonight, the silence is doing something stranger. It's starting to speak. And what it says doesn't always sound like you. Tonight, we'll slip deeper. There's an African proverb that goes, "The axe forgets, but the tree remembers." A gentle way of saying that those who hurt you move on, but you, the one sliced, carry it. This is the quiet genius of emotional manipulators. They don't need to shout. They just move on, while you're left blinking, trying to remember if what just happened was real or not. If your instincts were paranoia, or if your gut was screaming something your heart was too polite to hear. In 1950s Ghana, just after independence, a subtle psychological war played out not between colonizers and the newly free, but within the very leaders of the new nation. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first prime minister and later president, was hailed as a visionary, a hero of Pan-Africanism. But not all revolutions need chains to create control. Nkrumah grew increasingly paranoid, reportedly consulting spiritualists before decisions, dissolving political parties that questioned him, and creating what many now call a psychological monarchy wrapped in populist robes. Historians still debate whether his later authoritarian grip was the product of corrupted power or trauma from being repeatedly undermined by colonial forces. See, even history doesn't always know who the bad guy is. You sit with that thought. In your life, who do you still hesitate to blame? The cousin who only calls when they need something? The boss who compliments your resilience while assigning you double the workload? The lover who used the phrase, "You're so sensitive," like a blade disguised as a kiss? These people rarely scream, but they carve quietly. There's a theory called the double bind. first described in the 1950s by anthropologist Gregory Bateson while studying families of schizophrenic patients. In short, it's when someone puts you in a situation where no matter what you do, you're wrong. If you stay, you're weak. If you leave, you're selfish. If you cry, you're dramatic. If you're calm, you're cold. This is manipulation not as an act, but as an environment. It's not the storm, it's the air pressure before it. You can't name it, but your lungs notice. You see this not only in abusive relationships, but in cultures too. Take South Africa, mid-20th century. The apartheid regime created not just laws of segregation, but psychologies of inferiority. Black South Africans were told they were separate but equal, while being denied land, jobs, dignity. It was a gaslight of national scale. And yet, here's your obscure fact. During this time, there existed an underground radio station called Freedom Radio that transmitted poetry and coded messages in song lyrics. A rebellion not just of action, but of thought. It whispered, "You're not crazy. This is real." It's one of the most tender things, isn't it? Finding someone or something that tells you you're not crazy. You think about the messages you've gotten in your own life. Not the direct ones, the subtler ones. The sideways glances, the raised eyebrows, the jokes. That didn't mean anything. Remember that friend who always made you feel small, just when you were starting to feel proud? The coworker who accidentally left you out of the group chat? The partner who insisted you imagined the change in their tone, even though your bones felt it shift? Gaslighting isn't always a bonfire. Sometimes it's a single, steady candle burning behind your confidence, melting it one drip at a time. Enter Frantz Fanon, Algerian psychiatrist, anti-colonial philosopher, author of The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon wrote, "The oppressed will always believe the worst about themselves, because that's what they've been trained to do, not by accident, but by repeated, low-grade psychological corrosion." Fanon believed colonialism wasn't just about land, it was about identity, that it rewired people into believing their captors were saviors and their cultures were burdens. If you've ever apologized for taking up space in your own life, you already understand Fanon better than most scholars. Let's pause here for a moment. You're still with me, aren't you? Breathe. You're not being paranoid. You're remembering. And sometimes memory feels like madness, because it's trying to speak in a language you've been taught to doubt. Obscure cultural tidbit. In pre-colonial Congo, there was a class of spiritual advisors known as the Nganga. These weren't just healers, they were mediators between physical and invisible realms. People brought their worries, their dreams, even their grudges to the Nganga, who would perform divinations using shells, bones, or even water. One Nganga proverb, "Even a fish that dies by the river still fears the water," which is another way of saying, trauma doesn't vanish when the threat is gone. It lingers. It shapes behavior, even when safety returns. Maybe that's why you still flinch when your phone rings after 10 p.m., or why compliments make you suspicious, or why love feels like something you have to earn. Let's drift back into the story. You're walking down a narrow alley now, stone walls on either side, ancient, textured. You can smell iron in the air. Maybe it's blood. Maybe it's just the memory of it. Hard to say. A poster peels from a wall beside you. It's not written in English, but you swear it says your name. You keep walking. A final whisper for this section. You are not weak for being fooled. Manipulation isn't about intelligence. It's about vulnerability. And vulnerability is not a flaw. It's a feature. It means you're human. And here's the kicker. The best manipulators are usually the ones who never admit they are. Sleep on that. You're walking slower now. Maybe it's the weight of realization, or maybe it's the metaphorical mud beneath your shoes. Either way, your pace matches the gravity of everything you've absorbed. In this part of the journey, the manipulation isn't loud or theatrical anymore. It's quiet, calculated. The kind that happens in dinner table silences, behind carefully folded napkins, in a polite, from someone who has already made up their mind. You step into another room, softly lit. It feels ancient, somehow not just old, but timeless, like it's held every kind of conversation that humans are capable of. Arguments without raised voices, apologies that mean the opposite, agreements signed under pressure. You sit in a high-backed chair that creaks a little under your weight, judging you, maybe, or just tired of hosting people who don't realize when they're being controlled. Let's talk about silence, shall we? You've probably heard the phrase silent treatment tossed around like a slightly wilted tennis ball in your interpersonal playground. But it's more than a passive-aggressive pout. In psychological terms, silence can be weaponized as a form of emotional withholding, a strategy where the manipulator makes you feel like your very existence has become invisible. It's control not by action, but by absence. They don't yell, they don't correct you, they just stop seeing you. This particular method is deeply disorienting. You crave reconnection, validation, clarity. And when you're deprived of those, you begin to question yourself. Was I too harsh? Did I say something wrong? Maybe I'm overreacting. And so, you try harder. You dance closer to the puppet strings, trying to appease a puppeteer who pretends they're not holding anything at all. In a 1,965 study by Dr. Gregory Bateson, a pioneer in systems theory and communication, the concept of the double bind was explored. It describes a situation where an individual receives two or more conflicting messages, with one negating the other. For example, "You should always speak your mind," followed immediately by a punishment for doing just that. "You're trapped, whatever you choose is wrong." And guess what? Silence can be a double bind. You're told you're overthinking things, but also expected to read between lines that were never spoken. Neat trick, isn't it? Now, let's travel not far geographically, but in tone to a time and place where silence was as potent as speech. South Africa, mid-20th century, during the institutional horrors of apartheid. Among the many psychological manipulations at play, one of the cruelest was silence as erasure. Black South Africans were denied not only basic rights, but also the acknowledgement of their existence within the official narrative of the nation. No voices in the books, no faces in the broadcasts, entire communities treated as shadows in their own homeland. It was a chilling masterclass in national-scale gaslighting. Even those who spoke out were met with legal muzzles like the Suppression of Communism Act in 1950, a law so vague it could silence anyone who opposed injustice by simply calling them subversive. The irony, of course, is that by silencing opposition, the regime only made dissent more powerful underground. Historians still debate whether the psychological toll of this silencing had a more lasting impact than the visible brutality itself. After all, bruises fade. But confusion about your own worth, that lingers. You notice a mirror in the room across from you now. It's hazy, like someone's been breathing on it for too long. You approach it slowly, watching your own reflection distort slightly with every step. Here's a quote to whisper to yourself as you stare into your own eyes. "The most dangerous thing about communication is the illusion that it has occurred." George Bernard Shaw. Manipulators count on this illusion, that something felt is the same as something said, that eye contact counts as reassurance, that a sigh, a smirk, or a shoulder shrug qualifies as agreement. But as you may have noticed, vagueness is not kindness. It's fog laid over a trapdoor. Let's turn briefly to an unexpected place for a lesson in wordless control. Ancient Mali. Yes, the empire of gold and learning, home of Mansa Musa and the great city of Timbuktu. But beneath the grandeur, a quieter power dynamic existed. In the royal courts, it was not uncommon for disputes to be settled through the act of symbolic silence, ritualized nonverbal gestures, posture, and spacing were used in formal assemblies as clear indicators of dominance or submission. A ruler might simply lower his eyes or remain motionless, as a way of communicating disapproval. And trust me, in that context, silence screamed louder than a war horn. Interpretation of body language became a survival skill. Sound familiar? That's because manipulators today do the same thing. They study your response to silence. If you squirm, they know they've won. If you fill the gap with over-explanation, they've pulled you into a trap. If you apologize, just to break the tension, they learn that guilt is a button they can press whenever they feel like it. And that mirror you're looking into? Still fogged, still incomplete. Because even now you're thinking, but maybe silence isn't always malicious. And you're right. Sometimes silence is wisdom, restraint, reflection. But when it's consistent, targeted, and followed by reward only when you conform, that's when it's a leash. Take a breath here. You've been thinking a lot. Maybe too much. But then again, overthinking is what happens when you've been forced to interpret signals that should have been clear from the beginning. You sit down again. The chair doesn't creak this time. Either it's learning or you are. Let's consider a modern theory. Interpersonal deception theory, IDT, developed by Buller and Burgoon in the 1990s. This theory suggests that people lie differently depending on whether they are actively managing the other person's perception. And manipulators, being excellent perception managers, often rely on omission, subtle cues, and, yes, silence to create an illusion of truthfulness. They're not just hiding the truth, they're curating it. So when someone says, "I didn't lie to you," but conveniently left out something that would have changed your decision, understand, omission is an active choice. It is speech by other means. It is, let's say it softly, a wordless betrayal. And maybe, just maybe, you've been conditioned to think that calling it out makes you the problem. That naming what wasn't said is just making a fuss. Let me offer a counterthought. Naming the silence is reclaiming your narrative. As you stand again, the mirror finally clears. You look into it, and your face looks older than before. Wiser. A little tired. Yes, but tired in the way someone looks after surviving a long, confusing chapter and finally turning the page. You trace a small circle on the dusty mirror with your finger. And the silence? It's still there. But now, it answers to you. Let's keep walking. There's more to uncover in the quiet. You walk back into the stillness, and this time it almost hums. Not with noise, but with pressure. That strange, almost invisible heaviness that makes you pause for no reason. The kind of moment where a room doesn't just fall silent, it turns inward. You've felt it before. Maybe in a classroom, right before bad news. Maybe in a long car ride where no one wants to be the first to speak. It's quiet, but it isn't peaceful. And just like that, you begin to understand why silence is one of manipulation's favorite disguises. There's a phrase whispered in academic corners. The silence is the message. It's not original. It's borrowed, twisted, repeated. But in dark psychology, silence isn't passive. It's loud in all the wrong frequencies. A manipulator doesn't always need words to control you. Sometimes, they just need you to fill in the blanks with fear. In some rural regions of Ethiopia, there's a centuries-old practice of telekuku, a form of non-verbal social punishment, where an entire village can silently shun a member for stepping outside accepted norms. No yelling, no confrontation, just eyes that stop meeting yours, backs turned to your shadow, and voices that drift right past you like smoke. It's exile without movement. And weirdly, it works. Because being seen but not acknowledged strikes something ancient in the brain, something primal. You start doubting if you're real. Historians still debate whether similar practices in ancient Mesopotamian cities were codified law or communal instinct. But the result is the same, a psychological exile that leaves no visible scars, only echoes. You remember that hallway in your old job, the one that used to buzz with greetings and subtle office drama. Until one day, the buzz faded. You'd done something small, maybe missed a tone, maybe said too much in a meeting, and suddenly, your good mornings echoed. Emails got colder. The air-conditioned air even felt a few degrees less friendly. That's no coincidence. That's group silence, a manipulative language in its own right. There's a theory known as the chilling effect. No, not the weather report. In law and sociology, it refers to how fear of consequence, whether spoken or not, prevents people from acting freely. It happens in politics. It happens in group chats. You don't speak up, not because someone told you not to, but because you already know what silence might cost. It's a slow suffocation, carefully applied. Even in the animal kingdom, silence is power. Meerkats, for instance, fall into an eerie hush when a predator's nearby. But interestingly, sometimes dominant meerkats use this same freeze to intimidate lower-ranked ones. It's the "I'm watching you, and I won't warn you if danger comes" method of control. Sound familiar? In human life, manipulative silence often comes wrapped in the phrase, "I just didn't feel like talking." But what they mean is, "I wanted you to squirm." This tactic often blooms in relationships where power is unbalanced. Romantic, parental, professional. A sudden withdrawal of attention, affection, or acknowledgement becomes a pressure chamber. You begin over-apologizing for things you never even said. You rehearse conversations in your head, guessing what went wrong. You learn to fear silence more than anger. Quieter, quieter still, until you lose your own voice in the static. You pause here, not in the story, but in your breathing. The idea of silence as punishment hits somewhere in your memory. You don't need to name it, but it's there, woven into the kind of moment you once called tense, before you had language for manipulation. Ironically, philosophers have long argued over silence's value. Lao Tzu said, "Silence is a source of great strength." But he wasn't talking about cold shoulders. He meant inner stillness, not strategic ghosting. You think about all the things silence has been mistaken for. Wisdom, grace, maturity. And sometimes, sure, it is. But in the wrong hands, silence is a scalpel, one that doesn't draw blood, just doubts. And then, almost comically, your mind drifts to that time in 6th grade when your best friend said she wasn't mad but also wouldn't sit next to you at lunch for a week. That's the thing about manipulators. They start young. Of course, not every silent moment is sinister. Sometimes people are just quiet, tired, human. But manipulators aren't just quiet. They weaponize that quiet. It's the difference between a breeze and a vacuum. One more strange cultural note before you drift too far. In parts of Ghana, traditional talking drums were once used to mimic the tones and rhythms of language, sending messages between villages. But when something truly serious happened, like a death or betrayal, the drums didn't play at all. The silence was the message. And everyone understood. So perhaps the point isn't to fear silence, but to recognize its shapes, to know when it's peace and when it's pressure, when it's your sanctuary, and when it's their strategy. And when you finally do speak again, let it be not out of fear of silence, but in defiance of it. Now, let's walk a little further down this dim corridor. There's something else waiting just beyond the hush. You take another slow breath, deep into the ribcage, where old tension sleeps. The corridor you walk through now isn't entirely dark, but lit dimly by those vintage wall sconces your mind seems to conjure when it wants to feel safe. The floor is soft beneath you velvet, memory, maybe both. Either way, it keeps you steady, even as the topic turns sharp again. Because now, we talk about triangulation, not the kind used in geometry or satellite tracking, though those aren't bad metaphors. Triangulation in dark psychology is a tactic of manipulation that drags in a third party not for balance, but for chaos. Imagine this. Two people in a conflict. Could be lovers, siblings, co-workers. Simple, right? But add a third person, and instead of resolving the tension, the manipulator plays each person against the other, subtly or boldly. It's a triangle of shifting truths, and if you're inside it, you might not even realize which corner you stand on. The narcissist's favorite triangle isn't love, it's confusion. Here's how it works. A manipulator might say something like, "Well, even Sarah agrees you've been acting off lately." Suddenly, there's someone else involved. Someone you can't question in real time. Someone whose opinion has been weaponized to make you doubt your own. You don't know if Sarah really said that, but it doesn't matter. The seed is planted. Now, the conflict isn't just between you and the manipulator. It includes a ghost of someone else's disapproval. It muddies the waters, and before long, you're fighting shadows, not people. This tactic works especially well in families. Think of the classic parent pitting two siblings against each other. Why can't you be more like your brother? Suddenly, the brother is no longer just family. He's a measuring stick, a threat, a wedge. The relationship between the siblings gets poisoned, while the parent stays clean-handed. In psychology, this is part of what's known as the drama triangle, first coined by Stephen Cartman. In it, people shift roles, victim, persecutor, rescuer, looping endlessly in conflict that never truly resolves. A manipulator keeps the triangle alive by constantly adjusting the cast. They're the victim today, the hero tomorrow, the villain next week. And in the middle of that spinning triangle, you, always trying to fix, to prove, to explain. Historical records show that even monarchs used this tactic. King Henry VIII was infamous for triangulating his wives and court advisors, creating rivalry and suspicion among them so that no single faction could become more powerful than him. He'd pit Anne Boleyn against Catherine of Aragon, then pit Anne against Jane Seymour. Confusion kept him in control. Jealousy kept them distracted. That's triangulation at its highest level. Disorient, divide, dominate. But it doesn't take a palace to do damage. In modern relationships, it can look like a romantic partner constantly bringing up an ex. She never complained about how I did things. A boss comparing employees to create unhealthy competition. Mark stays late every night, and he doesn't whine. A friend quoting another friend's opinion to shame you. Jess thinks you're kind of dramatic too, not just me. What makes triangulation so devastating isn't just the manipulation, it's the isolation that follows. You start trusting people less. You wonder who's really on your side. Paranoia settles in. And slowly, the manipulator becomes your only safe person, because they've convinced you everyone else is against you. It's a trap. One built out of mirrors and whispers. You pause again because that part stings. Maybe it reminds you of a certain relationship, a moment where you were made to feel like the outsider in your own life, where trust got blurry and you weren't sure whose version of reality to believe. It's okay. We're here to observe, not blame. In tribal communities in Papua New Guinea, conflict resolution often includes a third ear, a neutral party whose only job is to listen, not interfere. Their presence exists specifically to prevent triangulation. Because in these cultures, it's well understood where there's a third, there's potential for division. Manipulators reverse this wisdom. They insert the third person to create friction, not clarity. And here's the hardest part. Even when you recognize triangulation, even when you say, "Wait, I never said that," or "Let's talk to them together," the manipulator often resists. They'll dodge, change topics, insist they were just relaying the message. Because the moment transparency enters, the triangle collapses. And that means they lose control. You realize now, manipulation thrives in fog. Triangulation is just another tool to keep you spinning inside it. So how do you escape it? You reclaim direct communication. You reach out to Sarah yourself. You ask Jess if she actually said what your friend claimed. You remove the middleman. You step outside the triangle and plant both feet in your own clarity. And when the manipulator protests because they will, you respond not with fire, but with stillness. Sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is say, "I'd rather talk to them myself." Let that silence speak for you. Let the triangle crumble. Now, take a breath. The walls are still soft. The air is still quiet. And you're still here wiser, slower, more certain. Let's keep walking. The psychology of control has more corners yet to explore. You take a gentle turn into the next corridor, as if your mind knows the path already. The walls here are darker, not in a menacing way, but like a velvet theater curtain pulled closed, muffling sound. You are entering a chapter of silence, the silence of stonewalling. It doesn't look like much at first. No slamming doors, no raised voices, just stillness, withdrawal, averted eyes, a conversation that stops mid-sentence and never resumes. Stonewalling is a tactic of emotional shutdown, a form of psychological warfare disguised as detachment. It's not the calm after a storm, it is the storm made invisible. You've seen it. Maybe you've lived it. A fight begins. Something important. Something charged. You say how you feel. You ask for answers. You say, "Can we talk about this?" And then, nothing. They walk away. Or they freeze. Or worse, they stay in the room. But their face goes blank. Their mouth closed. Their eyes cold. No words. No nods. No recognition that you're even there. You've become air. That's silence. That's stonewalling. Not always angry. Sometimes it's quiet, even polite. But beneath it is the same cruel message. You don't matter enough to be heard. In the hands of a narcissist or manipulator, stonewalling isn't just avoidance, it's punishment. It's used to control the emotional rhythm of a relationship. To say, "I'll only speak to you when you behave the way I want." It conditions you. First, you panic at the silence. Then, you tiptoe to avoid it. And before long, you learn to betray your own truth just to keep the silence from returning. That's how it works. In long-term relationships, stonewalling often escalates into what's called emotional extinction. The person being ignored begins to feel less and less real. Their voice shrinks. Their thoughts become self-doubt. Their inner monologue starts to whisper, "Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I talk too much. Maybe I was wrong to ask." And there it is again, the erosion of self. Quiet, slow, surgical. Researchers from the Gottman Institute found that stonewalling is one of the 4 behaviors most predictive of divorce, right alongside criticism, defensiveness, and contempt. But it's not just romantic relationships that suffer. In families, it creates lifelong emotional hunger. In workplaces, it becomes toxic professionalism. In friendships, it mimics apathy, but feels like betrayal. Historically, entire governments have used stonewalling as a tactic of domination. Think of totalitarian regimes that ignored protests, refused to acknowledge dissent, or erased people from conversations entirely. In Soviet Russia, dissenters were often not executed but silenced, removed from photographs, omitted from records, stonewalled by history itself. That's how deep this tactic runs. It isn't loud, it's not messy, but it erases. Back in your own life, the moments begin to surface. The text they didn't answer, even though you saw them online. The birthday they forgot after a fight. The apology they refused to hear. The night they turned away in bed and didn't look back. Silence, in these moments, wasn't peace. It was strategy. And yet, stonewalling is often misunderstood. Some people defend it, saying, "I just needed space," or "I didn't want to make things worse." And sometimes, that's true. Healthy detachment is real. Stepping away to cool down can be wise. But the difference between space and stonewalling is intention. Space says, "I need a moment, but I care about this." Stonewalling says, I'm done engaging, and your feelings don't matter. It's not the act of walking away that defines stonewalling, it's the refusal to return. The narcissist, especially, uses this with flair. They may withdraw after a conflict, only to reappear later as if nothing happened. No acknowledgement, no repair. Just emotional whiplash. It teaches you one thing: don't expect closure. And if you ask about it, you might hear things like, you're too sensitive. I didn't do anything. This is why I don't talk to you. And now, the blame is yours for trying to communicate at all. The psychological effect is cumulative. Over time, stonewalling can lead to complex trauma, where your nervous system stays in a constant state of alert. You begin to fear silence. You check your phone compulsively. You dread key-at rooms. You crave reassurance, but feel guilty for needing it. You start to disappear from yourself. But here's what's important to remember in the darkness of this hall. You were never too much. They were never willing enough. Healthy people don't weaponize silence. They use it to reflect, not control. They step away to heal, not to dominate. And you? You get to reclaim your right to be heard, reclaiming that voice can be quiet too. Not a scream, but a steady whisper. It might start with a boundary. If you shut me out when I need to talk, I will no longer chase you. Or even, silence isn't a solution. It's a symptom. Let them feel the weight of your stillness, not as punishment, but as protection. Let them wonder why you don't come knocking this time. Let your peace become your statement. Because when stonewalling is the game, disengagement is the answer. You no longer need to beg for sound. You are enough, even in silence. Now, inhale slowly. Let that truth echo through your bones like a lullaby whispered through a canyon. Exhale, and move forward. We still have deeper waters to walk through. But for now, know this. You are returning to yourself, word by word. You wake up in a room that feels both ancient and freshly lived in, like someone folded time into layers and handed you the keys. The curtains, if they can be called that, are heavy velvet and slightly damp at the bottom. They smell faintly of incense and something far more mysterious, possibly regret. You don't remember falling asleep. That's how it works with manipulators, too. You never remember the exact moment they slithered past your boundaries. One moment, you were laughing at their jokes, and the next, you were apologizing for having needs. But this isn't that kind of room. Not tonight. Tonight, the shadows lean kindly. Even the chair creaks in a way that says, you're forgiven. You sit. You listen. You remember. Remember when we talked about silence as a tool? That moment of non-response used like a blade? Well, there's another side to that same sword ritual. Manipulators aren't always chaotic agents. Some are engineers of routine, quietly reinforcing control through predictability. Take, for instance, the quiet manipulations of Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar in the 19th century. Historians still debate whether she was a nationalist genius or a tyrant. What's clear is her power didn't lie in speeches or declarations. It was in small habits, repetitions. She maintained rituals so deeply woven into her people's lives that disobedience didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like blasphemy, like leaving the kettle to boil dry. You sip tea now, or maybe it's just warm water you're pretending is tea, because sometimes the act matters more than the substance. That's what ritual does. It softens the psyche, makes obedience feel like continuity. Manipulators know this. It's why cult leaders insist on songbooks and matching shoes, why certain parents enforce meal times with the efficiency of an Echian non. Airstrike. Structure, under their rule, becomes a velvet leash. Quote, time? Let's bring in Carl Jung. In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. He might as well have been sketching a profile of a smiling sociopath in a cardigan. And just when you think you've built immunity, you realize how even digital rituals have been restructured. Consider how algorithms manipulate your attention. It's not just about showing you what you want. It's about showing it exactly when you're weakest, right after an argument, during a bout of insomnia, while waiting in a checkout line. Ritual, hijacked by data. Obscure cultural tidbit for the evening. In parts of West Africa, it was believed certain griots could manipulate memory itself not through hypnosis, but through the repetition of stories. If they told a lie often enough, people remembered it as truth. And who's to say they were wrong? Repetition isn't just reinforcement, it's transformation. Manipulators love this. They repeat stories about themselves, about you, until their version becomes canon. You always overreact. You never listen. I'm just trying to help. Their repetition isn't accidental, it's architectural. They're building a story where they always win. Remember the scent of that velvet curtain? It's stronger now. The incense has shifted. Sandalwood, and maybe a trace of old paper. This room is memory, woven into fabric. You glance out the window. The street from Section 4 is still there, dimly lit, quiet now. But the same bench sits under that flickering lamp. You once watched a man sit there, whispering to pigeons as if confessing secrets. Now the bench is empty, but you can still hear the echo. This script has been about control how it finds you in conversation, in silence, in gestures, in myths, but mostly in small things. That's what makes it so powerful. It never kicks down your door. It rearranges your furniture while you're asleep. You pull a blanket closer. Your body knows it's time to exhale. You've journeyed through history, theory, and lived experience. You've lingered in African courts and under neon streetlights, brushed past ghosts and algorithms. And now, the manipulator's voice fades. The room grows even softer. There is no twist ending, no dramatic escape, just you, in the stillness, fully aware now. Aware of how manipulation works. Aware that knowledge doesn't always protect, but it prepares. Your eyes grow heavy. The curtain rustles again. Not ominously, just enough to remind you the world keeps moving, whether you're awake to steer it or not. Let go now. You've earned the sleep. We'll be here again, another night. Same tone, same shadows. A different story. Good night.